Hey there. Today's topic is embrace detours to make life transitions shorter. Hmm. I know you may not quite know where I'm going with this, but stay tuned and I will make it very clear. So, we all know about detours, uh, especially when we're driving and there's construction, we get detoured often. Or if we are driving and there's a big accident, we may get detoured. Those are some of the less, uh, you know, less desired detours. One travel detour that I actually really enjoyed was years ago when mom and I were in Hawaii and we were driving around on the big island and we saw a sign that said 4 mile scenic route. And we're like, what the heck? We don't have a time schedule. So we took the little detour or scenic route, as it were, and we had a fabulous time. It was one of our most favorite memories from the trip. So those are like the good kind of detours. Now, I'm not going to spend more time talking about that because, of course, I'm going to be talking about life transitions. Now, if you get the offer of a dream job when you're not expecting it, that is one type of detour. And you've got a life transition going on. And if it's a dream job, it's probably something pretty positive. However, sometimes you might get an unexpected new medical diagnosis. That also is a detour life transition, and it may be less than positive, more towards the negative piece. So, why do I say to embrace them? That we're going to embrace detours to make life transitions shorter? Well, there are a couple of different reasons. Remember, could be positive or negative in terms of the detour itself. So, sometimes it's an adventure. Okay, so you want to embrace it because it can be an adventure. Sometimes, as I mentioned, embracing the detour can shorten it. And sometimes embracing the detour means that you learn something that can be used in other parts of your life. So, three different reasons to embrace them. And so, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we're going to embrace. But I just want to remind you that we can't usually avoid the life transitions. So, we may as well go ahead and embrace them anyway, because otherwise, oftentimes things are just a little bit more challenging. So, the first step, as it were, to embracing is discover. And by this, I'm talking about knowledge because we all know that knowledge is power. Now, there are a couple of things you may not think about when you think about getting some information about the detour itself. One is the difference between change and transition, and the other piece of information is about the general cycle of life transitions. And I'm not going to go into those here because I'm going to do a different Facebook Live on those. However, on lifetransitionsorganizing.com, I do already have some articles about those. So you can get that information there. And then, of course, you want information about your specific life transition. Now, in this particular case, I'm talking about having just enough information, because the last thing we want is for you to get information overwhelmed, because that will definitely not help during your life transition. All right. Next one, number two, dealing with grief. Now, we usually think of grief as something that happens when someone close to us or maybe just an acquaintance dies. However, grief, experience grief in lots of different situations, and it definitely happens in life transitions. But the thing is that usually we're just sort of trying to push right on through that life transition, and we may not even realize that grief is happening, or B, don't understand that really embracing and that grief will help us get through and again shorten the life transition time. So because there are tons of different models of grief, I'm gonna sort of put it in three different phases. The first is the daze phase. So that's sort of that shock, numbness, denial. since I'm recording this during COVID times, that would be how we were in like February, March, and maybe into April, where we had sort of the denial, the numbness, etc. Then there is also the distress. That's when we start, losing sleep, maybe losing our appetite. We have a sadness, we have anxiety, all that kind of stuff is the distress piece of it. And then there is the discover phase, and that is sort of the acceptance, letting go, learning how to function, the recovery phase. Well, the thing about grief is that it's not linear, which is why it's not really a cycle. That's why I haven't talked about it as a cycle, because you can move back and forth between the different phases several times. And it may even look different. So the days phase may be really long, and then you go into distress, and maybe that's short before you go back to days. So and it may be different parts of the life transition. You go through days and distress and discovery with the different parts. So that's why I'm not saying, oh, it's a nice little cycle, because it's not. And it has to run its course. And the other really important thing here is that the amount of time to go through the phases will differ for everyone, even if you are all experiencing the same life transition, like right now with the global pandemic and where people are, what phase they're in, and if they're not at discovery and sitting there and fully accepting or whatever, probably ping ponging back and forth between them. So, again, different people experience it different ways. And the third piece is differences. So, really acknowledging that you have a difference in the ability to manage energy, time, tasks, stuff, etc. It will not be the same as before the transition, and that's okay. We like to put a lot of stress on ourselves, thinking, well, I used to be able to do this just fine, and now I can't, or it takes me longer, or I can't get it finished. The thing is that when you're going through a life transition, things are not the same. Adulting is not the same. And we have a lot of habits. Some are default and some are by design. But if we just think about sort of those regular everyday habits, checking the mail and the email, bringing in the groceries, whatever all we're doing, going to and from an office or not, as in now, um, habits that you really had down pat before a transition may get lost in the transition, um, because things are different. Again, just think COVID, among other life transitions we could be discussing. So if you had some default habits that were really not working well for you, the challenges around those may be magnified during the life transition. So again, just something to be aware of. And from my perspective as a life transitions organizer coach, all of this really goes hand in hand with your organizing and productivity and knowing yourself and understanding how to manage yourself. So let me get a little bit more specific in case I've lost you somewhere in here. For example, often during a life transition, your energy is limited, and that would be your physical, your emotional, your mental, your spiritual, all of those kinds of things. And understanding that it's more limited, we have to figure out how to manage the differences between the high energy and the low energy, because you can't always have high energy. And so when you're looking at sort of that high versus low energy, you have to look at what activities make me feel good and give me energy versus what activities destroy my mood and drain my energy. And the reason I bring this piece up is that from a productivity and organizing point of view, your energy really impacts things like decision making and focus. And so if we put those things off until we're at low energy, it's either harder to do or we procrastinate. And that is just a couple of, of examples. Along with that energy piece, we're going to look at the scheduled time calendar piece. Slightly different, but I will speak to each of them. So the first thing is, I know it's not a surprise. We only have 24 hours in a day. That doesn't get shorter or longer during a life transition. So we have to remember that. As adults, many of us schedule more than we should in 24 hours, and that's why we end up losing sleep. So we have to sort of take that into account. Do I usually overschedule? Well, I'm gonna have to figure out a way to not do that as much because I've got some new things happening because of the life transition. Also, under the schedule piece, the calendar habits. Maybe before the life transition, you had kept everything in your head, not something I advise, by the way. But maybe you need to, you need to take on a calendar habit, or maybe before you did put appointments and things like that in a calendar, but you didn't put the drive time or whatever, or white space in between things. That could be, it's very, again, very important all the time, but especially important during a life transition. All right, time again factors into the schedule piece. So, do you have a good sense for the passage of time, or do you sometimes get lost in time? Sometimes that happens in terms of we're working on something and all this time passes, we don't even realize it. We look at our clock or the watch or our phone and we go, "Oh my goodness, how did all that time pass?" Some people are more prone to that than other people. Again, not a good or a bad thing, it's just a thing, and it's something to be aware of, because if that happens to you, you can always use things like timers or other things of that nature to help with that. Another big piece that people experience a lot is underestimating how long a task or a project will take. And especially if you're going through a life transition where you are doing tasks and projects that aren't as familiar to you, or maybe you've never done them at all, really doing some estimating and then adding time. So maybe time and a half from your original estimate. I would say double, but for most people, they're like, no, I can't double it. So let's just really try time and a half and see what happens. And all the calendar, the schedule, all this kind of stuff. You've heard me talking about tasks. Well, you've also heard me say before that you will always have more tasks that you either want to do or need to do than that you have time to do. So during a life transition, again, this gets magnified. And so oftentimes we're responding to the urgent and we're forgetting the important. So that's one thing that we need to really take a moment and look at, consider, because then we may readjust or reprioritize. Also, with tasks, we need to monitor things like perfectionism and people pleasing, because again, that can cause things to take longer. And when you're adding in some tasks and projects that aren't normally there, we need to shrink the amount of time, as well as shrink some of the expectations around the tasks that we have, and maybe delete or defer all those good kinds of things. The last piece to this is the stuff piece, because we can't just talk about sort of that productivity piece without talking about the organizing piece, because they always go hand in hand. So the thing is, again, hadn't changed, happens with or without a life transition. You have a maximum amount of space in your home and in your office. And I know there are all sorts of things you can do and buy and things like that to expand it, but let's just go with this idea that there's a maximum amount. And so one thing to really look at during a life transition is acquisition habits. Do you tend to acquire lots of stuff anyway? And is there specific stuff that you need to get as a result of this particular life transition? For example, if you're moving, you probably need some boxes and packing tape and all that kind of stuff. So again, something to consider. Oh, I'm bringing in some different stuff. Where's it going to go? What am I going to do with it? And again, from a regular organizing perspective, do you usually bring in something into the house or office and put it on the first open spot you have? Or do you have a specific home for it? Because again, you're going to be bringing in some new stuff and you may need to restructure that particular habit depending on what it is, or you may need to delete some things altogether to make space for the new ones. because again, life transitions require often, not always, require specific items. And so that needs to be adjusted for in your space. Whew. So there we are, three different things. Discover, because knowledge is power, deal with the grief, and acknowledge differences in your energy, time, tasks, and schedule. And by recognizing and accepting and embracing these three strategies, you'll more easily manage the life transitions that pop up periodically. Now, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. You may agree, you may disagree, you may have been surprised by something. So, whatever your reaction, I'd love to see some comments in the comment section. And I do thank you for tuning in.